Tēnā koutou e ngā iwi, ko Ian Johnson ahu, no hawa uru maramatonga ahu. Ke mawhera I tai o Potini ahu e noho ana, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou, katoa. Kia ora, welcome. That was my hei paku mihi, a traditional Māori greeting, a personal introduction that would generally precede my speaking at the beginning of any gathering, meeting, assembly, seminar or conference. It places me and us in a wider context, linking us to a common ancestor, our ancestral lands and waterways, and our relationship with the land and its people. I'm not going to provide a literal translation, at least not yet, but I am going to circle back to why I think it is significant contextually to us, guides, storytellers, or whatever designation you prefer for the role you have. Kia ora. In the time I have today, I'm hoping to touch on something you may not have heard or considered before, or at least deliver it in a way that causes you to pause, to reconsider, to recalibrate. I intend to be somewhat provocative, to maybe entice you down a few rabbit holes of your own. And I'd like to deliver some practical and effective tools. I know that on almost any specialist subject or skill that the people watching this, that you all bring to the polar regions, you know more than me, so be gentle. I'm just going to take a seat and now get this show started. Hey, look, thank you very much for taking the time to attend this evening. You obviously note that I've got closer to the screen because the glasses have gone on. And I'm hoping now that you can see that. So getting started. First thing I'd like to do is acknowledge the Polar Tourism Guides Association for inviting me to do this through Graham and then through associations I have here in my home on the West Coast. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. The reason I'm here is because 16, 17 years ago, I attended a 2-day Dr. Sam Ham workshop. And, I think that what we do as interpreters is summed up by Sam's statement there on the left-hand side. Sam is the author of the book Environmental Interpretation, a practical guide for people with big ideas and small budgets. And interpretation, making a difference on purpose. I attended his workshop, we became friends, and he literally changed my world. The foundations of Sam's work, like all great work, stands on the shoulders of all those who went before him. His 2-day thematic interpretation workshop, the one I attended, is supported by a 20-page reference list that covers 200 years of the biology and psychology of communication. You're going to see a number of slides. Not much work. I'm not going to read any of them to you. They're up there for you to read. I'll be the old bald dude in the background babbling on. So when Sam says this, he is very simply and very plainly stating what the science tells us. As interpreters of these just awe-inspiring places I think we're really, really privileged to travel to, this clearly stated fact of human biology, neurology, and psychology tells us that if we want our guests, and I'm going to use the word guests because I was born into the polar regions in the quark environment, and they use the guests, and it's something that I have retained when I've come back to my other work. But if we want our guests to love what we love just as much as we do, to have our passion matter as much to them as it does to us, and to be inspired to care about what we care about, the stories we tell can't be about us. They have to be about them, our guests. And in a world that appears to be getting more polarized every day, every side of every difference more certain that I'm right and that you are wrong, finding common ground seems to be getting increasingly difficult. Our primitive instincts of fight and flight, spray and walk away, seem to be once again leading the dance. So how did we get here? And look, this is very subjective. I'm a product of my age. I'm closer to 60 than 50. And, you know, all I'm doing here is giving you what I think best summed up by Edward Morrow, who World War II journalist who famously said, we're all prisoners of our own experience. So I'm a prisoner of my experience. But for what it's worth, particularly recently, there seems to have been plenty of documentary style content examining the effect of social media on society. And the anonymity, etc. aside, the biggest impact I see on us, and this us throughout this first half of this is us, guides, storytellers, lecturers, people who go and work in these polar regions, is that we more and more hang out with people who agree with us. You know, what started off as people who like this, also like this, sort of has got these algorithmic virtual rooms running now where everyone in the room likes what you like, and everyone in the room dislikes what you dislike. And you know what? Being right about everything is a bloody comfortable place to hang out. And the note of caution for me here is that my experience in the polar regions was, I mean, environment's fantastic. I mean, loved everything about it. Magnetic places that I can't wait to get back to, but it was the people. I had never hung out with a group of people that I was so aligned with in terms of my core values and the way that I wanted to integrate myself into a team with a group of people. And that's the reason that I keep on wanting to go back. There's an inherent danger in that, though, in terms of we're not only talking to ourselves as guides and lecturers, we're talking to a really diverse and dispersed group of people. And I also believe that the tendency to group like this, you know, we tend to, at the moment, the focus is on putting all this emphasis on social media. I believe it preempts that. So, you know, I'd like to take it back a wee bit further. And for me, I would look at this here. So, you know, I remember in the mid 90s when there was the explosion of the 24-hour news channels and it happened really quickly. It shifted from the place where you went to where the facts were reported to a group of organizations that seemed focused on capturing a segment of the market. And now when I watch, if I can be bothered switching on the news items or anything like that, what I see is two deaf people shouting at each other. And, you know, unless our plan as the lecturers and as the guides who we're the people who want to plant new seeds of belief, who, you know, unless we only want to preach to the choir, I think the first place for us to start is by examining and reflecting on our own stories. And so here's what we know. Good stories are scientifically proven to engage the listener. I'm going to concentrate on 4 of our brain chemicals here. They cause the brain to release primarily dopamine. And dopamine is our drive system, wanting, pursuing, achieving, progressing, focus. I think most importantly for me, when people consider dopamine, because it's also the addiction chemical, is people think it's the thing they strive to get when they get what they want. It's not. Dopamine is released while you're trying to attain the goal, not when you're attaining the goal, but in pursuit of it. And sort of evolutionary terms, that makes sense, right? You know, we weren't the biggest, the strongest, the fastest, the fiercest, but man, you know, I mean, we could track our food for days and days and days until we just wore it down because we had that goal in front of us. So, and you know, for me, I'm obviously from a much softer generation that I didn't have to track my food for days. This idea of this dopamine release and this idea of being in pursuit of something, I think of the books that I read when I was a kid that I couldn't put down, that I wanted to hide under the covers with a flashlight after lights are out and read because I wanted to know what happened next. Most recently, I've seen this as being in an evolution, I think, of television companies like Netflix and Amazon Prime have tapped into this with their binge watching. You know, the storyline each week will contain its own storyline, but also an ongoing narrative that threads throughout the entire season. And, you know, if you asked someone to watch a 10-hour movie, they'd look at you like you were freaking insane. But that's effectively what we're doing when we sit down and binge watch an entire season of a show. So, you know, dopamine, this is where we take people on the journey with us. Adrenaline and cortisol, right? These are the threat detection and protection system. These are the chemicals that we want in our body and out, you know, anxiety, anger, disgust, alert. I call them the bump in the night chemicals. You know, if you ever lay in bed and you hear that bump in the night, the interesting thing about that for me is elbow the person beside you when you're in that state and without even knowing what you're elbowing for, they wake up. So adrenaline and cortisol, right? These is what switches on. And then oxytocin. This is number 4. So oxytocin, our bodies release oxytocin. This is the soothing and bonding system, contentment, safety, feeling cared for, trust. That's all the unicorns and the rainbows. So for me, a good story makes us more alert. It connects us to the places and the people and the things that we're interpreting. And most importantly, it helps us to see things from different perspectives. And this little following bit, I'm only going to give the lightest of touches, and it's a seriously deep rabbit hole, but one that I can recommend taking at least a shallow dive if you have the time. So, before these important and meaningful stories that we want to tell, and before they get to play with the chemistry sets of the people we're telling the stories to, we need to engage our guest's cerebral cortex, more specifically the prefrontal cortex. It's the bit that's embroiled in planning, complex cognitive behavior, personality expression, decision-making, and moderating social behavior. And it's the latest and the last to develop. In fact, in adults, males and females, mid-20s before this bit of the brain has basically fully got itself wired in. We want to engage that as opposed to what? So as opposed to, in a nutshell, the more primitive parts. Now, these parts in the cell at a cellular level are exactly the same as these other parts. The brain's not a click together parts of pieces that in evolutionary terms, it's just found different uses for the same matter and wired it differently as it's got older and bigger and wiser. And the more primitive parts are the brainstem, the midbrain, the other bits that control our innate and automatic self-preserving behavior patterns, ensuring the species survival, and our limbic system. This is a sort of loose collection of cells implicated in motivation and emotion, and wherein sits the amygdala. And this is shown to control our instantaneous emotional responses. And it's therefore responsible for many of our judgments, such as discerning between good and bad, safe and threatening, friend and foe. So I love this metaphor. Jonathan Haidt. I think this relationship is also beautifully encapsulated by Dr. Robert Sapolsky, neuroendocrinologist out of Stanford and author of a really highly accessible book called Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. He describes the relationship of the prefrontal cortex to the emotional center as trying to do the right thing, even when it's the harder thing. And I guess the question I'm trying to provoke us to think about is how can our stories encourage our guests to put the rider in charge and not the elephant? Because crucially, here's something else that we know that under fMRI and that we know this, is that when we tell people that they're on the wrong team, that they're hanging out with the wrong crowd, the elephant charges. And all the prefrontal cortex is capable of doing from that point is rationalizing the decision to charge and telling them why they made the right decision. And when I say they, and I'm talking about us as well, right? We rationalize making these decisions once that elephant charges. So I think the first place as storytellers and lecturers that we need to look is actually closer to home. So I'm going to borrow bits and pieces from many different disciplines. A lot of you will be familiar with this. It's the Joe Hari window. Essentially, in a nutshell, obviously what we're trying to do is increase our open area. Doing that by, we've got little circles here. I think most critically for me, talking with a friend a couple of weeks ago, and we're working on reigniting a program in my region around an experiential leadership center. It's a program that Dave Ritchie developed actually, and we were talking about what the secret source of those leadership programs is, and it's feedback. And so if you're sitting there now and you're not aware and familiar with some of the feedback models, I'm talking commend, recommend, keep, stop, start, John here and self and peer, get familiar with them. And most importantly, learn how to take feedback. It's actually a lot easier to give than to take. And that still throws me. Getting feedback is still the hardest thing I find to accept. This next 5 slides, they're a little bit wordy than most, but they actually are really succinct in terms of the ideas that they're expressing. And this is about testing our assumptions. This is from a business methodology. called appreciative inquiry. So again, we've just drawn something from leadership. Now we're drawing something from a 21st century business model. So as you read through these, I might provide a little bit of commentary, but I'll just leave them up there for a few seconds and let you read each one. Just be aware, I will actually have a PowerPoint that I will, sorry, a PDF that I will be able to put this into if people want to have access to this information. That'll be more than the slides, or it'll have this content that I'm talking about as well. So quite happy to make that available and make this stuff available to anybody who wants to use it. I really like this one. This takes me back to one of my favorite films, which is Akira Kurosawa's 1950 film Rashomon, where he tells the story of a man's murder and the rape of his wife, and he tells it from 4 different perspectives: the perspective of the bandit, the wife, the samurai, and the woodcutter. This one here. So when I was preparing this content for a business presentation, but not a storytelling presentation. And I had a podcast running in the background, and Joe Rogan was, I can't even remember who he was talking to, but he was talking about his experience with the dudes that go out and go squatching, who go look for Sasquatches every weekend. And he was saying that in every other way, in those first few days, they seemed like perfectly normal human beings. Like, they had families, they had jobs, they seemed like reasonable people, but they had this one thing. And he talks about the moment that was really driven home, that heading back to this cabin with this guy, and off to the side, they heard a bullfrog. And the guy stops and goes, "Do you hear that?" And Joe goes, "Yeah." Bullfrog goes, "No, Sasquatch. They imitate other animals." And they go a little bit further and they hear the bullfrog again. The guy goes, "See, I told you so." I mean, that's it, right? When we fully believe something, we anticipate it, we're going to find it. And lastly, and I guess most importantly, there's a little bit in here that says, talks about generative questions. And so generative questions are the sort that cause people to examine their own feelings and thoughts about things. These are sort of questions like, so you've done something like this before. What was that like? What did you think? Can you tell me more about what you're thinking? It's asking them to bring context to the stuff that we're interpreting for them. And we're going to touch on this again with a different name that actually comes from storytelling. This here, far too wordy to look at, will be made available. I'm just going to flick through it, and I would just hoping everybody examines. I'm going to split this up into its 4 parts. I'll leave each slide up for only 15 seconds. Have a quick look at it. Notice these things, and I'd like you to apply them to yourself, not to our guests. I want these to apply to us. I mean, that top one there, we store memories differently based on how they were experienced. I just read some research recently where they went back to people who had been in New York and had direct experience of the September 11th. And they asked them to recount their memories from that day, and they found that 90% of people had false memories from that day, not on purposefully, but they had integrated the 24-hour news coverage and other people's stories into their own story, but the memories were as real as anything they had actually experienced. I'm going to delve into the dark arts a bit now as well. Again, another another sector we can look at, advertising, marketing. These guys have known for years how to connect with people and how to overcome the charging elephant and put the jockey in charge. This saying here, I found this basically preempted last year doing some reading from mid-19th century satirist and novelist. I think he used to work for Vanity Fair, called William Makepeace Thackeray, whose writing's fantastic, but should be venerated just for that name alone. And he, in a little piece that I was writing from him, he had stated the two most engaging powers of an author are to make new things familiar, familiar things new. So we've known for centuries how to stop the elephant from charging. And, you know, our thinking depends on metaphor. So we understand your complex things in relation to things we already know. Where this really struck me as being really relevant was working with interpreters, language interpreters on the ships when we're over in the regions. That, you know, if there was no translation, especially with the Mandarin guys, if they didn't have a word for the piece that the lecturer was talking about, they'd just go quiet. Some of that had to do with potentially maybe losing face, not seeing confident. And it was a really simple requirement. What was required is that the lecturers and the translators needed to sit down and they needed to be familiar with the content before they translated, so that they had the ability to go, what is that? We don't have anything like that. And this could be any language. Okay, so what does it look like? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? Okay, well, it's kind of like this. And that's what was required in those things to give continuity. Otherwise, you had potentially had people missing out on whole sections of understanding of the stuff that we're really hoping they understand. This next one, this is something that advertisers know. This is called the ladder of abstraction, and a concept is an abstract idea. And when I think of this, the really obvious, most obvious example for me is a car. So, you know, you ask, and I've tried this, you ask people what their first car meant to them, and generally you end up somewhere around some idea around freedom. And then you think of all the way that cars are advertised with the music, and, you know, you never see a car in gridlock on a motorway being sold, right? They're always out in the middle of some rural road, or maybe it's a little urban commuter, but it's going through this nice leafy suburbs. You know, what they're selling at a conceptual level. We argue over the details, we sell at a conceptual level, we execute at the details level. Advertisers have understood this for years. Again, from advertising, Tim Stapleton. So, you know, used to be you could put something outrageous up on YouTube and it would go viral and you would get your 1 million+ views. Not anymore. 300 hours of video uploaded every minute. And, you know, what Tim has worked out is that there are 5 things that he says that they have to do to get that they look to work on in terms of putting a presentation that's going together up on YouTube. These are them. Now, you know, I look at those and there's nothing there that makes me feel like I need a shower afterwards. And, you know, I'd suggest done by us and with the integrity, honesty and heart, that the qualities that are bound in our work, those are really quite relevant and worthwhile things to strive for. And, you know, in terms of the advertising, what Tim's talking about, right, they say that if you can achieve 3 out of 5 of those, that's what they call their holy grail. And I think this is relevant. Again, this is the other part of the whole social media thing that's actually a positive, right? If you put a bad or a shonky product out there now, within hours, it can have traveled the world and your business is destroyed. So in a way, for me, the whole advertising and marketing has gone full circle. It has to be authentic now. Otherwise, it's going to get called out. So that's sort of pretty much the first half of what I wanted to do, just to touch on some things that I hope that we can reflect onto. I hope be better at what we do, or at least more engaged with a diverse audience. I'm going to close this section out with a little quote, and then I'll just allow a couple of minutes for people to get a drink, and then I'm going to blast through some really quick ideas on how we might shape our stories and some practical tips for guiding. Kia ora. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to. I am going to resume. This is quite. Sorry, it's a little bit disconcerting. I'm not being able to see anybody. I'm much more comfortable doing this in a room where I can see people. So, look, I really hope this is going all right. I know that some of this stuff would have been touched on. I know that if there's Quark people here, that they know a lot of my thematic stuff. I know that a lot of you have worked with Dave, who's also very solid and very good in this space. So there will be some repetition, but hopefully there's some new stuff in here as well. This for me is the key when we're putting presentations together in the environments we have, is to have a theme. Because a theme is the major point of message that guides the development of your story. It answers the questions, so what, and big deal. And if you can present a strongly relevant theme in an organized and enjoyable way, you can provoke people to think, even if they forget isolated facts, and you increase your chances of making a difference on purpose, which is sort of the subtext of this whole presentation. And as much as a theme helps focus your story and plant seeds of belief, a good theme also tells you what to leave out so that it is more focused. Okay, the key to this is at the bottom. You know, we interpret a lot of stuff that is that's tangible. And so linking these tangible things with these intangible things, the universal themes, that's universal concepts, that's what you want to wrap your theme around. So, you know, if you took a minute to pause and think about your favorite novels and films, what was the theme? Remembering that a theme might be represented in a variety of ways. You might state it up front and again in the conclusion, right? This is Dale Carnegie, you know, tell the audience what you're going to say it, then tell them what you've said. It might emerge or be stated in the conclusion. This is pretty much the format of most jokes, you know, build, bang, then you hit them with the punchline. Or, and this is my favorite one, if your presentation is really solid, it's implied, but it's never stated. I mean, true love is so powerful it will defy even death. That's the theme from Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare never actually states it. This great theme is from Knock-and-Crag. This is one of Scotland's most important geological interpretive sites. It's the place where 19th century geologists first discovered that land masses could thrust upwards, sideways, uplift, fold over, and so that what was once on the bottom ended up on the top. It inspired Sam to create what he called knocking theory. And this is the idea that, you know, where the opportunity arises to make something more interesting by connecting it to something else that has a higher inherent interest. Another really good point for me when we're looking at connecting with guests. So this is from Dr. Joseph Campbell's seminal work, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. He was a 20th century mythologist and I'd say philosopher. And, you know, the point is here, if we go back far enough, we're all telling the same stories. There is some universal themes and common connection that we all share. And that was sort of Joseph's epiphany in doing his work and starting off in the 1930s and 40s, where he realized that across every culture that he was examining, they all had the hero story. This is the story of Buddha. This is the story of Muhammad. This is the story of Christ. This is the story of multiple Indian gods. And I guess, you know, in context for me, if we think about our own lives are actually an evolving story, and we're constantly integrating a reconstructed past because our memories are really fallible, perceived present, and an anticipated future, and we're trying to bundle those into our own coherent and vitalizing life myth. And I'm pretty certain that I am sort of paraphrasing or quoting someone there. I just can't remember who. So I guess the question that I ask when I think about this is, because myths are created, myths aren't necessarily old things. We're creating and writing our own mythologies all the time. As a group of storytellers and guides and lecturers who get to talk to people, I'm wondering if we can start to create some new myths that help carry us towards the future that, truth be told, we can't predict, but maybe we can help shape. Dr. Joseph Campbell's thing there, the arc, the hero's journey had 8 spokes in the wheel. I've seen it with up to 12. This picture will make sense in a minute. is that early last year, talking to a bloke who tells stories at primary schools, goes into primary schools, tells stories to kids and teaches them storytelling. And he said to me, "Oh, Ian, Dr. Campbell's, I can sum that up so much more quickly." He was talking about the arc of the story, and it was this. And the reason the House slide is up there, when he said that to me, I thought, my God, you could have saved me 8 seasons of House. That was every episode. And then I thought of all of those other serialized episodic television shows. It's every episode of all of those shows. And it works, obviously, because they're the ones that seem to run a long period of time. They go 7, 8, 10, 11, 12 seasons. So, you know, we may disparage it, but it works because we're watching it. A little bit around structure of story now. So we're going to do the 4 P's of a compelling story. People. And when I say people, metaphorically people, right? You know, this is there's also the tangible things in the stories we do, and it can be the animals. And, you know, I think the clearest example of this is the person who's done this best for 60 years is the classic Attenborough. I mean, unless you're really aware of it, you don't even know that he's doing it. He is consistently narrating the internal monologue of an animal that has got no idea what it's thinking. And it's beautiful, and it connects us to it. You know, as she looks and the sun comes down, she wonders, should she be worried that she hasn't found her cub? And what, you know, I mean, he's got no idea what the damned animal's thinking, but my God, it's beautiful and it's work, and he's been doing it for 60 years. And as human beings, you know, we tend to anthropomorphize everything because we really only are capable of seeing everything in our own context and through our own experience. This one for me, I think of the evolution of Mickey Mouse, right? From essentially Steamboat Willie, who was a bit of a rat, to the round, cuddly, you know, all the right shapes that Mickey Mouse has become now. If you really want to follow how compelling this can be, have a look and do some research onto the domestication of Siberian Arctic foxes and see what happened there. I mean, it's extraordinary in 50 years and generations what happened to change the relationship. Purpose, okay? The moment our guests think that the story we're telling them has no relevance to them, they'll tune us out. The plot, it provokes our guests to ask questions about the journey and become engaged in the story on their terms. That's the key to all storytelling, right? It's about it's about what we overcome. You know, I think of the places that we do. What can we do to involve the senses with an image like this? And for me, quite often, you know, we have all of that space sometimes when we're traveling over the Drake and we tell a lot of stories and we give some history and things and getting people prepared. I think some of the stories we tell when crossing the Drake would be better told after people have been out in the environment and experienced maybe a bit of cold and some wind chill and some bit of discomfort for a time, because then we're able to contextualize some stuff for them and make them reflect on the stories that we're telling them better. Horrible man, but, you know, don't tell the story of the flock or the herd or the group if you don't have to. I mean, again, classic Attenborough, tell the story of the one. Our guests will pay more attention, feel more connected, and have a stronger emotional response. Again, good stories are about what we overcome and how we change. The protagonist, again, where you have the opportunity to have a protagonist threaded through a story. Most stories have at least one, and generally only one. And the reason for this is obviously we find it easier to follow. I guess one of the most extraordinary things for me is, and this goes back to the Joseph Campbell hero's myth, you look at all of those hero stories, there's a story that's common to every corner of the globe on Earth throughout the history of humanity. It seems that story has existed. And that hero is always pushed out into the world, right? It's never comfortable. And I think the reason for that is that if it was really comfortable, we'd sit there and we wouldn't follow them. We'd say, man, you could have just sat at home and this would have gone away. And this was brought home to me when listening to an old interview with John F. Kennedy. And after he'd just been elected, and a journalist asked him, how did you become a war hero? And Kennedy was a legitimate war hero. And he said, it wasn't voluntary. They sunk my boat. Look for opportunities to interpret the things that you're seeing through the eyes of the characters who've explored it, overcame it, saved it, or were affected by it. Our guests want what we all secretly want, and that's the gossip and the drama behind the artifacts, the events, the landscapes. What were they thinking? Look, as an aside as well, I read recently that 60 to 80% of all conversation can be categorized as gossip. Probably be quite pleased. I'm going to shut up for a little bit now and just let the next few slides speak for themselves. I will make a PDF of these tips available for anyone interested. To give this some context, I class what we do as sequential communication. That is, we control the order in which the content is delivered. And that's as opposed to non-sequential communication. Think of all those interpretive signs, and this is an area that I used to work in doing interpretation for museums and galleries, that you spend hours on, that you can walk up, read any line you like, and then walk away. I mean, it can be devastating watching the time someone spins in front of your work of art before moving on. We have a huge advantage with what we do. Let's go. I think this one's important. I think too often we start off trying to write an introduction. An introduction can only be written once you know how your story is going to conclude. This is my favorite, foreshadowing. Easier to do if you know where you're going as well. Don't leave them hanging. So look, I'm back. We're just about done. Productive questions. Go back earlier, I used that business model from appreciative inquiry where I talked about generative questions. These are pretty much the same thing. A productive question doesn't isolate anyone, and it engages our guests with where they are. Examples of productive questions are: have you seen anything like this before? Can you smell that? What does this remind you of? Unproductive questions, and I've heard enough of them asked over the years, particularly in a museological setting, as other factual recall type questions. So what date were these islands first settled? How many litres are lost each day? All they do, the only thing you can possibly achieve is make someone feel stupid at some stage. Props. We have a lot of stuff that we can't touch, but we do have stuff that we can be tactile with. If you can use props They take the focus off you and they give your guests something to play with. And prompts can be used to illustrate a point or engage clients in conjunction with productive questioning. And I guess again, for all of this, for me, which is while I'm hoping this is going all right today. It's not my comfort zone. Is that we are visual animals. Human beings are visual animals, and I think, for me, the clearest body of research that we have that actually confirms that was a point in time, and again, it's John F. Kennedy, 1961, Kennedy versus Nixon presidential debates. First ever live televised debates. But this is a point when about half of the population had televisions and access to them, and half of them didn't. And after that debate, when they surveyed people who had watched the debate on television, overwhelmingly, 80 odd plus percent, 90% thought that John F. Kennedy had won the debate. Those who listened to it, who didn't get to see him deliver, thought that just exactly the opposite, to almost exactly the opposite extent, that Nixon had won the debate. We are visual animals. So, before I leave the last word, and the last word's coming up now, I'm going to leave the last word to Barry Lopez, who in 3 minutes, I think, sums up the theme of my message today much more eloquently than me. I'd like to once again thank the PTGA for this opportunity. And as promised at the start, I'm going to circle back to the beginning of my presentation in my Hei Paku Mihi. Remember, don't leave the mystery unresolved. It's a personal introduction that places our ancestry in relationship and connects us to the land we stand on in common. And it finishes with the incantation, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Greetings, greetings, greeting to us all. Said not once, not twice, not 4 or 5 times, always 3 times, because it's acknowledgement of our past, our present, and our future. And closing for me, and I think our similarities, as I'm talking people in general, are much more abundant than our differences, and that we, the storytellers, the connectors, the guides, I think we can help model a way back to them. Kia ora.
So I was having a conversation with a traditional man one time, and we were talking about the distinction that we make in the West between fiction and nonfiction. And I asked him if that made sense to him. And he said no, he understood how I was using the terms and that they were useful to a certain extent. But he said, for us, the difference is not between fiction and nonfiction, it's between an authentic and an inauthentic story. And I said, well, what is that difference? And he said, an authentic story is about us, and an inauthentic story is about you. And in that moment, I saw something crucial for me, and that is that the story that you tell as a storyteller is not worth our listening to if it's just about you. We don't need to know about you. We need to know about us. So if you're going to tell a story and you want it to be an authentic story, it seems to me it's got to do 2 things. First of all, it's got to help. The story has to help. And the second thing is, it's got to be about us. The listener or the reader does not want to be in the position of being lectured to or being treated as somebody who's not capable of knowing or treated like an outsider. And that's a very valuable lesson for me as a writer. If I go someplace, I'm trying to listen to people different from me, saying something with great history behind it about what it means to be a human being. And then I want to come home and compose a story and offer it to my own people and say, this is what they said. What do you think? I want everything that I write to end with that note. Here's what I saw. What do you think? Instead of saying, here's what I saw and here's what you should believe. That can be part of it for me as a storyteller. I want more than anything to see people do well. I want to see people thrive. And the system I see in place all over the world is a system that is killing people. And I feel that as a physical pain. I feel a sense of grief every day when I get out of bed. And despite my own failings as a writer, as a human being, the driving thing behind me is, if you're going to tell a story that helps. And if you're going to become involved with other people, become filmmakers or artists or whomever I'm going to become involved with, make common cause with people whose desire is to help. Not to direct the show or tell somebody else what to think, but to behave in a helpful manner for the benefit of everybody, every being.
Yeah, so that's it, I guess. Thanks very much. I didn't have access to any of the things. So one of the things I think I should mention is that I know that Lauren, there's something coming up on Tuesday, I believe. If Lauren would like to post that or talk to that. Couple of questions here. What is your recommended next steps for someone who wants to become a better communicator? How do we take an interest in these systems you presented and actually get good at them? I guess a couple of things: work with each other. I mean, half of what you saw up there came from me, is motivated by, has changed markedly over particularly the last 3 years, working in the polar environments and getting feedback from the people who are doing your jobs, who have had suggestions for me, and watching them work, watching some people that I've sat there and I've walked away and I've learned more than I had to give. I guess one of the other things that I've always liked to do is that I do know that when anything that I do is really only coming from my point of view, and that I know that I freaked a few people out when I first started working in the polar regions and working with the lecturers. They would ask me, what did you think of me? And I didn't have as much feedback as they wanted, because I was more often than not watching how the guests were responding to them, because that's who they were talking to. They weren't talking just directly to me. And you know what? If all of the guests were leaning in and they didn't have their phones out and they were nodding and they were engaged, then it was working, regardless of what I thought. So, get out, do it again and again. The better you get at this, the more responsive you come to the live feedback you get from doing it in front of an audience, where you'll do stuff, you'll try it and it'll fall fit and you go, whoops, that didn't work. I'll do something else again. Or, hey, I got a really good response from that and I'll try that again. Several interested in the PDF, they can refer to you later. Yep, I'll get that to Lauren and get that out to people. Does Ian have any tips for an effective use of tone of voice when storytelling? God, I'm not sure after I do, but I'm not sure how I sounded across. I had no feedback on that myself. So I guess, emotional, tone of voice and pitch matter. It's important not to be, you can put someone to sleep when you're droning on, but, I think if you're enthusiastic about what you're doing, your sense of enthusiasm, your integrity, your honesty, and if you know you're in material, that shows and people buy into it. Okay, so next Tuesday session, using citizen science as a tool to become a better educator. Look, kia ora, I hope you got something from that. Lauren will have my contact. I'm available. I mean, this is the stuff that gets me out of bed. It excites me. I love working with people. I love learning from people in this space. I'm learning new stuff every day. So thank you very much.